I'm credited with coming up with the term public intellectual, and I set it against an academic intellectual. And I think that remains, sort of the mission, that we have to, be intellectuals, but we have to be public intellectuals. We have to write and address a public and not just a discipline. It can be done. It's not easy, but it can be done.
All right, welcome back, friends and comrades. I'm very, very pleased to welcome Russell Jacoby to the program. Welcome, Russell. How are you this morning?
I think I'm okay, I hope.
Well, I was compelled to reach out after reading your latest article in Jacobin magazine entitled American Marxism Got Lost on Campus. And I felt that this was a very important intervention. A lot of what we do here is sort of para-academic. So we bring a lot of people that are really have very little academic training in Marxism, and we link them up with maybe people that do. And as you know, the Academe has undergone pretty profound transformations in recent years with austerity, and the private academy has also had a huge influence on the public discourse, much of which has been I think a negative influence in certain ways, which maybe we can talk about. But your first you first came on my radar many, many years ago when I read your wonderful book called The Last Intellectuals, American Culture in the Age. What is this? American Culture in the Age of Academia. Is that what it is? And this was about the time that I was studying the history of Marxism, and it really helped me understand Trotskyism, and it made me a little bit nostalgic, maybe is the right word, for a public discourse that was allowed for a sort of real and intense engagement on Marxist ideas. And to see that decline that you document in that book was tragic, but also compelled me to read about Marxism a lot more. As I've mentioned to our reading group on Losurdo, we recently did a reading group on Western Marxism that was recently translated and released with Monthly Review. I think your book, Dialectic of Defeat, Contours of Western Marxism, stands out as sort of what I would consider to be the third major text on Western Marxism next to Perry Anderson and Losurdo's. Before we talk about your article in Jacobin, could I invite you to share your impressions and your maybe criticisms of Losurdo's book, Western Marxism?
Okay. I mean, I'm happy to participate in a discussion about it, and I should acknowledge my total knowledge of Losurdo, or my introduction to him, is through your podcasts. I mean, I was not aware of his writings until I started looking at some of your podcasts where you introduce him and discuss him. And I should also be careful to say that I only know his book on Western Marxism. I don't know his other books. You refer to his books on Nietzsche, on Kant, and his other works. So I'm approaching this as a bit of a novice on terms of his own work. But I have looked at the Western Marxism book, and I can't say that I find it convincing. Almost the reverse. I mean, he seems, from my point of view, the 20th century, or at least the last 50 years, doesn't even exist for Losurdo. I mean, he's writing as if Nothing has happened since, I don't know what, the revolution in Hungary, or the invasion of the Hungarian by the Soviet Union. I mean, he is simply restating, and a position can be made for the importance of China, Soviet Union, Vietnam, the great anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggles. But it seems to me that this is an argument which has certainly been made over the course of the last 50, 100 years, but you can't simply just restate it. You have to say, what has happened to these countries? And on that score, he is totally silent. I mean, he quotes Mao, he quotes Ho Chi Minh, he quotes Lenin. So on one hand, you have Adorno sort of, disrespecting nationalism, and his reply is Ho Chi Minh, defeating the French. One doesn't have to discount any of those struggles, but it's insufficient at this date simply to hold them up as shining lights and not say anything about, what has happened to them, or, to what extent are they really Marxist or socialist societies? Yes, they fought colonialism. I get that. But it's insufficient, and he's on that score. It seems to me he's a complete ideologue, a dogmatist. He doesn't ever enter into any of the details about what has happened to these countries, and to what extent that Marxists in the West should look at them as models. Their anti-imperialist efforts can be saluted, but that's insufficient at this point. It seems to me, and it's like it's just dogma. He doesn't ever say anything more except we don't appreciate enough how much they fought and what kind of obstacles they overcame. Okay, that's fair, but that's not enough anymore.
Point well taken. I suppose to play Losurdo's perspective, one value that I find in his criticism of Adorno, say, on Vietnam, or Horkheimer's sort of embrace of American imperialism, is the sense that utopianism within the tradition of Western Marxism has contributed to this sort of allergy to think about seriously contesting power. And I think that there is a lot of truth in that. In other words, it's a claim about how, and he shows this through the way that Western Marxist thinkers kind of loosely incorporate non-Marxist paradigms of thought, from Hannah Arendt to Foucault, and that he shows the sort of effects that has on their political imagination and their willingness to think the role of the Marxist theorist in the class struggle. So you see the point. I think that it's better read that way. I don't read him as saying that we must reproduce Dungism, or a kind of post-Mao market socialism, or socialism with Chinese characteristics, even though he is in favor of that. I think, though, at the same time, he's inviting us to think about the direction of post-Mao China in such a way that is different than how Adorno thought it, because Adorno really didn't see anything salvageable. And this is very similar to Slavoj Žižek's view on China, which is completely dismissive. I'm not really sure that this is the best way for Marxists in the core Western regions to be thinking about the various projects of state socialism, on the one hand. On the other hand, I do think that Losurdo also brings to bear some criticism of these state socialist projects. One of the big things that people will criticize Losurdo is that he abandons the dictatorship of the proletariat. And so he doesn't think Marxism can overcome the state. And that's a valid criticism of Losurdo, I think. But on the flip side, I think what he's injecting into the discourse is very healthy for Western Marxists to think, which I think that the Foucauldian French theory has prohibited us to think, which is this question of power and seizing the means of production and being serious about anti-imperialism. That's what I find valuable. But again, I can read him against the grain. I don't need to read him dogmatically. I mean, I think you're right that people can do that, and I think that poses a certain danger.
Well, again, there's a lot to be said about it. First of all, I don't, as a critique of Western Marxism, I don't know where Hannah Arendt fits in at all. I mean, he certainly has some damning things to say about her, which I don't disagree with, but she certainly was not a Western Marxist at all. Foucault, also very peripheral to Western Marxism. Putting that aside, I would have to disagree. I think it's legitimate to raise the question of power and the state. But again, to take the model of Lenin and Mao and say, they dealt with these issues, and the Western Marxists haven't, and also then to say, well, they deal with, they're dealing with utopia and the end of work at the same time, and this is the way he always talks, at the same time that the Chinese and the Russians are building a society and fighting imperialism, the Western Marxists have, talking about utopia. Well, I'm sorry. I mean, the situation is very different, and it's not either or. To say that the situation in the Soviet Union and China was building an economy, and yes, resisting invasions and imperialism, but that's not the question in France and the United States. And the questions of some kind of consumer society and affluence were issues which have to be addressed, and to discount them, which he does. I mean, he basically says, "Oh, the Western Marxists are interested in these kind of esoteric issues, and the real issues are anti-imperialism and power." Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, the world is full of Marxist groups that are founding political parties and want to seize power, and are serious about it. But it doesn't make it doesn't make them effective. I mean, there are issues in the Western capitalist societies which are different than in the Soviet Union, the ex-Soviet Union, and in China. And he simply says, these people aren't serious because they're not anti-imperialist and they don't take the struggle important. I mean, I could almost reverse it. I mean, the problem of the New Left was it was too third worldist. It lionized Mao and Ho and even North Korea, that they were the answer. And that was, I mean, it wasn't the problem of the whole New Left, but it certainly became part of it, as instead of looking at issues of Western industrial societies, people were holding Mao's little book as if there was somehow some relevance to organizing peasants and a national struggle in Berlin or London or New York. I mean, there was a kind of third worldism, which was a problem. It wasn't too weak. It was too strong. I mean, not always, but it certainly was part of the story of a leftism. And in 2025, I mean, when was this book published? A couple of years ago, 2022. To hold up this kind of anti-colonialism. I mean, Algeria. I mean, North Vietnam. I mean, are we holding up these as models which are going to inspire Marxists today? Again, one can say they have accomplished something and they threw out the imperialists, and they should be saluted for that. But are they creating societies which we can embrace, which seems to be, emancipatory? I don't think so. At least the evidence isn't there. And Losurdo doesn't even try. I mean, he never comments on the situation besides quoting the leaders. I mean, Horkheimer would say, calls it state capitalism at the very moment that the Soviets are fighting the Nazis. Well, that's not an answer. I mean, first of all, Horkheimer's authoritarian state was actually written before the invasion of the Soviet Union. But in any case, it's not an answer to just, to quote the historical record and say, these people discounted the great struggles and the power and the organizing. And he says that again and again. He never enters into the fray. And I think this is part of the paradox of people who always talk about power and organizing. All of a sudden, they become abstract. I mean, it sounds practical. We need to organize. We need power. We don't need Ernst Bloch talking about utopia. Okay, fair enough. But there's lots of groups that try to organize. The history of Marxism is full of political parties. It says, let's get practical. Let's organize. Let's do something. It doesn't mean it works. One has to sort of grasp the society you're in. And it seems to me it's insufficient just to hold these models and say we should, be more supportive of Vietnam than Adorno was. Okay, maybe, but where does that take us?
Yeah, I mean, you're making some great points. Although the latter point you just made is very much in concert with Losurdo's vision of Marxism, because he continuously, one of the things that he also diagnoses, which is almost like he thinks that Western Marxism has a tendency of a type of vulgar class reductionism, which he criticizes in Italian autonomism, for example, where they don't see what he calls the multiplicity of struggles or sort of non-class forms of oppression. And so he thinks that, Marxists should pay more attention to national struggles, for example. And so I think where Hannah Arendt and Foucault come in his vision, is when you get to Hart and Negri. And I think here he makes a good point, which is a point that John Bellamy Foster has also made, which is that what Foucault and even Deleuze inject into the Empire series and the theory of the multitude, and how they reframe the theory of exploitation, and they abandon imperialism. Okay. So I think that that's a valid criticism of them. He also sees a similar move in Agamben, and as well as in Zizek. So there is this problem of what we call post-Marxism. Now you can decide whether you want to work with Losurdo's Marxism, which has a kind of post-Stalinist Dungism. And I myself don't follow Losurdo in that way. I wouldn't associate my Marxism that way. But that's not going to prevent me from benefiting from reading his work. Because as you mentioned, I mean, he does have a lot of great historical studies. He has a great book on Kant, on Hegel, on Bonapartism. The one on Nietzsche is his, I think, most important. The Western Marxism is a polemical text. And I wanted to ask you, as you think, because you wrote recently a kind of critical reflection on your book, The Last Intellectuals. And I wanted to ask you what a critical reflection back on Dialectic of Defeat might look like.
On Dialectic of Defeat? Well, I don't know if I could put that in. I mean, it was an effort to defend a Western Marxist tradition, a non, if anti-Leninist tradition, which was based on council communism, maybe some kind of Rosa Luxemburgism. I'm not sure what I retract. I mean, I never agreed. I mean, he takes on Perry Anderson, and I never agreed with Perry Anderson really, because Anderson, in a certain way, doesn't totally disagree with Losurdo in the sense he always saw Western Marxism as a detour from classical Marxism. Classical Marxism was political economy and organizing, and Western Marxism was a product of defeat. Well, this is exactly what I take up, that in fact, sort of the fetish of success in Marxism has in fact distorted it. Because yes, we say, well, Lenin succeeded, Mao succeeded, Ho Chi Minh succeeded. We should imitate them. And my argument was no. I mean, they succeeded, to some degree, but they are not that successful model can't be replicated in the West. So I'm not sure what, I'm sorry to say, some of my books haven't worn so well, but I'm not sure what I would retract in that Dialectic of Defeat, because I consider just, in that sense, it applies to Losurdo, who lionizes success and anti-imperialist struggles and says, we've minimized them and we don't appreciate them. And again, okay, that's fair enough, but can they be models for Western Marxists at this point? And how could they, without at least coming to some sort of appraisal of where they are? And he doesn't do that. I mean, I should hasten to say, you refer to my piece, I don't think Western Marxism, in the degree that it's become an academic enterprise and a kind of an insular one, has the answers either. I mean, this is the irony of the trajectory of Marxism. It has become mainly an academic exercise, and I I sort of joke in that piece that the left took over comparative literature and sociology, and the right took over the country. How do you put those two things together? There was a colossal failure here in terms of academic Marxism succeeding within the university, but nowhere else, basically. So we have thousands of Marxist, sociologists and feminists and cinema critics and but the impact is extremely limited.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good bridge for us to talk a little bit about the historical basis of that limitation. One of the points that you shared with me in your article that I found very striking, which is sort of an economic point about the possibility of intellectual life in America, which is, you said, when Edmund Wilson wrote for the New Republic, the fee he would receive for one article was enough to pay rent for a couple months.
Right.
And then he said, by the time of the 1970s and 80s, maybe it could pay for a couple meals, right? And that is very demonstrative right there, right? That is at the heart of something very important. And you also invoke, and I think this might be a good way to bring up a thinker that isn't talked about much anymore these days, which is C.W. Mills in his book on intellectuals and Marxist intellectuals. And I wanted to see if you could sort of bring up his concept, which I was very compelled by. He sort of gives these sort of a taxonomy of different types of Marxist thinkers. One of them that he favors is what he calls the plain Marxist. At the same time, the plain Marxist, he confesses, never caught on in American society. What is the plain Marxist according to C. Wright Mills, and why did they not catch on?
That's a tough one. I mean, first of all, Mills was a incredibly active and energetic fellow, and he never fully explained what a plain Marxist was. I mean, he rejected sort of the sectarian Marxist and the dogmatic Marxists, and he held up the plain Marxists. And he certainly saw himself uh, as a plain Marxist, someone who is situated in American thought and life. And as I think I mentioned in that article, it had no resonance because within the university, plain became, a curse. It was not high theory; it was low theory. Who wanted to be called a plain Marxist? You could be a structural Marxist. You could be a post-structuralist Marxist. You could be a Foucaultian Marxist. But a plain Marxist, that had no cachet. It wasn't sexy. And in that sense, Mills wasn't sexy too. He was a little too polemical. He was a little too untheoretical, even though he wasn't untheoretical. He was too plain. He was out there on his motorcycle, trying to shake things up. So I don't think no one subscribed to the plain Marxist. He was never clear what it was. I mean, he criticized sociological jargon. He criticized, the Talcott Parsons and others, and you had to write, plainly. And he tried to do that. And because of that, I think he, made a lot of enemies and was never appreciated particularly.
Yeah. So let me ask a question about that. So that, at first blush, it seems a little odd. What are the forces at work, would you speculate? I know like you said, it's difficult, that have pushed Marxism into this rarefied, sort of, well, it's only sexy when when you have a Marxism that appears with jargon or that appears with this highfalutin. Is this tied to perhaps a theory of elite overproduction? Is this tied to, I mean, Bourdieu writes a lot about this kind of
Right.
crisis in elite overproduction. Perhaps that might be one material, right? Political economic kind of rationale
Right.
as to why Marxism steered that way. But what might be some other factors?
Well, I think those are. I mean, I talk about in the last intellectuals and elsewhere that sort of the ethos of publish or perish. That was the ethos of the university. I mean, you had to publish or you disappeared. You lost your job. So there was a kind of an economic imperative to the university system to crank out stuff, no matter what its merits. And we know too that in many cases people were judged on the quantity of their publications. I mean, they say, well, we can't judge the quality. I mean, that's too subjective. So so there was, again, I don't know the status of it anymore. There was a citation index, which would measure how much your work was cited. And that became something which would be considered in terms of your careers. And it was pretty obvious that all that stuff was self-referential. I mean, if you were at Harvard, you were cited a lot. If you were at a community college, you weren't cited a lot. It all became kind of self-perpetuating. But it didn't speak to quality. It spoke to quantity. And again, these studies have shown most scholarly articles are not read. They might be referenced, but they're not read. So that yes, there was an element of uh, publish or perish, overproduction. I joke at one point about the falling rate of intelligence in one of my essays about as just as living labor diminishes in commodities, sort of intelligence diminishes in intellectual production. And to make up for the diminishment in the same way, you have to produce more.
Mm.
Just like in the world of consumption, you produce more because the profit is falling. You got to eke out more. So that becomes the imperative. And I think in this sense, Marxists were not exempt. So, they're publishing more and more. But again, read by smaller and smaller crew.
Mm-hmm. So the plain Marxist for Mills is sort of the Marxist, he says, who really works with the young Marx and the Marx of alienation, and has some fidelity to the proposition in Marxism that really Marxism is about a true transformation of the working class, right? And that in order to do that, we need to get serious about, sort of practical engagement in the public sphere and in political arena. And of course, one of the things I have recognized, I think that the absence of a viable socialist party perhaps might be one way to also really wrestle with the fact that Marxism has become somewhat unmotivated outside of the academic arena. So you have to ask yourself, what would compel a Marxist discourse to return to the dynamism that it once had? Partially, I think that the podcasting work that we do perhaps is one way to do that. To sort of have conversations that maybe the Academy wouldn't really be interested in, or if they would, maybe it wouldn't be reaching the right people, because most of the Academy is pretty closed off, in terms of their conferences. It costs a lot of money to attend. Now they have closed down Zoom options. You said earlier you don't like Zoom, but we should be honest that the Zoom option does democratize access to some extent, as I see it. So I think that the Socialist Party and the lack there is significant. But I want to invite you now to also say something about some of the bigger theoretical arguments about the absence of socialism in America. The first one being Werner Sombart's famous essay. And I understand that he was a German intellectual who never visited the US. Is that correct?
Yeah.
The title is Why There Is No Socialism in America. And the curious thing about his article is that he actually thinks that there's no socialism in America similar to the Louise Hart's liberalism in America. I think his argument's pretty close to Hart's. And it sort of goes back to this idea that, on the one hand, there is no feudal history. We do have a kind of Lockean origin.
Right.
So there's that argument. And then the other argument, I suppose, is that the class struggle just hasn't disenfranchised a class of intellectuals in particular. And this is interesting because today we find that intellectual labor is pretty exploited, really, with the adjunct problem. So in some sense, Sombart says, well, that's the ingredient for socialism to sprout. So in the future, he says America will be socialistic, but it hasn't been. What would you add to that synopsis? What did I miss in his argument?
I mean, the Sombart, is a key piece in this whole issue of the fate of socialism in the United States, and why it seemed like the prime territory for a Labor Party, a Socialist Party, a Marxist Party, and compared to France, Italy, Germany, they never really compared to some of the European socialist parties. And why is that? Particularly because it was a pure capitalist society in some ways. And Sombart's argument was largely economic. That there was a democratic ethos in America, which didn't degrade the worker. I mean, this was as part of his argument. That didn't look down upon the worker, but also the wages were too high, so that the American worker didn't have this kind of, culturally or economically, wasn't being pushed to the margins, and he saw himself, or she saw himself, as a good citizen of the Republic, and was paid relatively well. But the funny thing is, Sombart thought it was a temporary, it would not last, and that's how he sort of ends, that this This was a moment that would not last, and that this was sort of his ending of the book. And Marxists have been waiting for this moment to end ever since. I mean, it's gone up and down, but the moment, has not really. I mean, has lasted more or less. But the argument was an economic argument with a cultural component to it, I would say.
Yeah, that's good. So then the idea would be that there's a task of intellectuals in the face of capitalist crisis and immiseration of the working class to, engage in some type of class consciousness process whereby a socialist alternative is made possible, but this mysteriously has not come about. So why is that, right? The great mystery. And one of the things that has contributed to this, I think, is the idea that Marxist theory has itself become detached from practical, plain issues. And you show in your article, American Marxism Got Lost on Campus, which there's the short, abridged version that's public, but you also shared with me a much longer version. And you really show that Marxist theory, after really the 80s and 90s, has kind of splintered off into all of these different flavors. And to go back to the plain Marxist academic point of view seems, I don't know, seems impossible maybe, or sort of extremely difficult to do. At the same time, I do have the sense, Russell, that there is a desire for that, precisely because of the crisis of capitalism today, especially for young people. And so while I think that what I'm trying to say is that while I think there has been a certain strength or like a cachet that post-Marxism had, I think it's definitely on the decline, in my opinion. Okay. I suppose the other thing we should throw into here is the long tradition coming out of James Burnham's thought of the managerial revolution that has really falsely portrayed the professors as sort of having more power than they really do have. For example, we're right now having this Trump moment, and wokeism and all of these things are being put under scrutiny. But it seems to me that a lot of the thinkers that may have contributed to something like extreme liberalism, say for example Judith Butler. I was listening to an interview with Judith Butler, and she said that she doesn't really know what woke is, and that she's a critic of identity politics. So you see, there's this sort of paradox that goes on, whereby the right wing will point to a cultural Marxism conspiracy, when in point of fact, there's a kind of powerlessness of the professors, right? So is that all just the smoke and mirrors of the right? Or how do you parse all of that? You know what I mean? How do you parse this weird dynamic of elite overproduction and this kind of anti-communist hysteria where oh yeah, Kamala Harris and Biden are communists and all of this nonsense. USAID is communist, apparently, right?
Right.
Can you help us navigate some of these complexities?
Well, these are a series of very good questions, and I don't have a series of very good answers. I think, and some of the essays I've written, I talk about more recently that the university has ceased to expand in the way it has previously. So, in fact, a lot of students who would have stayed on and become, assistant professors and whatnot, have left the university and, get jobs as, in nonprofits or public relations, sometimes journalism, museums, And they have taken, from my point of view, really to a detriment, taken some of the jargon from the university and brought it into the public sphere. I mean, you mentioned Foucault. Well, the whole question of power differential, power in relationships, it becomes something which started in the university, and then students bring it out into the larger world, where it becomes, and this is true of the diversity stuff too. I mean, it was a university, basically having to do with admissions, and then spreads into the larger world. And I don't think it basically has been somewhat of a disaster. I mean, because we gave up class and we replaced it with identity politics, or photo ops. How pictures look is much easier to confirm than whether there's actually working class or poor people. We can see if they're Black or Latino or other people in pictures. That's diversity. So some of these ideas, I mean, I think the professoriate, yes, is largely insular, but their students have increasingly, entered the public world and taken some of this, jargon. I mean, the stuff, I cite in there, you can't say women, you say people's pregnancy or something, this kind of stuff, which starts in the university, then spreads to Planned Parenthood or some other groups. And it rightly irritates people because you're taking a very niche vocabulary, which really applies to virtually, a very small group of people. And you're taking it into the public sphere. And it hasn't worked. So there's this huge paradox here. I think the professoriate, yes, is seen as more powerful than it is. But I think it is true that its students have taken some of the vocabulary and brought it into the public sphere. And not to the benefit of society. And you mentioned earlier about, or before the podcast began, cancel culture. Well, the question of power, becomes the crucial issue. Who's using the First Amendment? Do we really believe in it? Well, let's look at through the lens of power. It's really for protecting, rich white guys. Well, if that's your argument, then the First Amendment begins to, disappear, and we're not getting into a more society isn't progressing, at least in my terms, it's regressing, because now everything is seen in power. There's no criteria besides that, and it seems to be that's a dangerous way to go. But over this is a huge paradox, because from Mills to Chomsky to everyone are bedeviled by the question of intellectuals. I mean, on one hand, intellectuals are servants of power. I mean, this is always the argument. It's Chomsky's, it's Mills, it's the Marxist. On the other hand, they have the ideas, and we see this in Lenin as well. And we need intellectuals. We can't do without them. They bring the idea of Marxism to society, and it seems to me that contradiction has bedeviled, Marxism and sociology in that sense, and no one has completely figured it out. And both are true, and we're stuck with that same situation. I think, no doubt, and I sort of, again, I joke in my piece that the left has taken over, comparative literature departments. The right has taken over society. That's a problem. That's a problem, that, the Marxists are strong in sociology and weak in society. How is that? They speak to each other. And have yet to master a public idiom. And
Right.
maybe you mentioned podcasts may be a way, a partial way out of that.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, I think part of it, you talk about language and jargon and speech. I will say there's a lot of truth in that. And it took me many years as somebody that was raised, doing manual labor. My parents were not college educated in any real way. And so when I would come home with these highfalutin ideas and these books, I mean, they just had no conception of how to even communicate to me. And so that took like a while to figure out how to overcome that. And it is interesting in a certain way, because what we have now is, Kamala Harris refusing to go on Joe Rogan is an interesting reflection of a logic of, I don't even know what it means. The idea that, well, Joe Rogan probably has millions of working class listeners, and he's some kind of libertarian, open-minded figure. Sometimes he's like a pragmatist. He sympathizes with what he likes at the time, right? So it's just very odd to me that intellectuals in today's time have such a kind of pernicious close-mindedness to things like public discourse, or even changing people's minds, or even like, convincing people, or sort of, yeah, that's tragic to me. And perhaps Marxism needs to enter the picture there, not by being a policeman over speech or virtues that people hold, or because then what you end up doing is basically saying, yeah, well, the working class is reactionary because they don't have education.
Well, again, I agree. I mean, you mentioned Hart and Negri. I mean, these books are not books written I mean, they're written for academics. I mean, basically, and I mentioned, the leading Marxist, who recently died, Fred Jameson. I mean, Fred Jameson was only known in comparative literature and in literature. He was considered, one of the leading American Marxists. He never wrote anything for other people. I mean, people wouldn't know him outside of graduate schools. I mean, that's a statement about, the insularity of American Marxism. Now, again, I don't want to underestimate. You can't simply say, well, you could write popular books. But one of the things, I mentioned already in the last Intellectuals, within the university, journalism was frowned upon. It was considered that wasn't serious. Oh, people can read it. Well, that's a problem.
Right.
It's not specialized enough.
I suppose that's true. Although you seem to be somebody that broke that mold, and I was going to maybe raise Christopher Lasch as another academic who broke that mold, just in the way that he wrote. I mean, Culture of Narcissism could probably be read by anybody, really. I mean, I teach it undergrads. It's a very accessible book, right?
Yes, I agree completely. But there are some exceptions. There's no doubt. But there's not that many.
But Christopher Lasch is seen as some arch reactionary by the liberal academics.
Well, I mean, not for that reason alone, I don't think. But I think in part, I mean, he did not participate in history conferences. He wasn't a professional careerist. For a successful guy, he stayed at the University of Rochester, where I studied with him, and briefly anyway. And he wrote, well. Now, again, there's other people who do that. I mean, he's not alone, and we could go through it. But a lot of the leading Marxists don't. They're known to only a few people, or a small coterie. And Judith Butler, was one of the worst offenders. I mean, she wrote stuff which was influential in small circles. And she, at one point she defended jargon. She wouldn't call it jargon, but she defended the necessity to write in difficult ways, because the language of common sense and common discourse was repressive, and this was an idea coming out of, yes, French thought, maybe some kind of Adorno thought, but I think it was a miscasting, but it was a very current idea that the language of common sense is the language of capitalism, and the language of subversion is extremely difficult and almost opaque, and that proves it's subversive, which is a great excuse, really, because the great subversives from Marx to Nietzsche to Freud were actually great writers.
Yeah, absolutely.
They were great writers.
They're great writers. They're great writers that, knew that the challenge of true theoretical production necessitated modifying your voice for a broader audience than just specialists.
Absolutely. And I point out part of the paradox of the university, and I know you've written about psychoanalysis, the last place you can study Freud is in a department of psychology. The last place you can study Marx is in a department of economics. The last place you could study Hegel is in a department of philosophy. You go, wow, how could that be? How could that be? I mean, they managed to purge from their natural homes. Yes, you can study Marx in comparative literature, or you can study Freud in the English department. But sort of their natural homes have been purged.
Well, speaking of Lasch, I recently interviewed a scholar, a historian who was doing his postdoc at Harvard, and he wrote an article that was very compelling to me. It was about the rise and fall of a journal that Marx and Eugene Genovese tried to start. I think it was called Marxist Currents, if I'm not mistaken.
Perspectives, maybe?
Perspectives. Marxist Perspectives, yes. And anyways, this author really documents in close detail, because he's writing a critical biography of Genovese. Okay. And of course, I don't support Genovese's rightward turn and all of that, but I do think his Marxist days were quite interesting. Speaking of Ho Chi Minh, he was saying that Genovese was one of the first Marxist professors to go full in with Ho Chi Minh. My house has changed.
He was the chairman of my department, Gene Genovese.
So anyways, it was interesting because the story really was a tragic one, because Lasch wrote an essay that was critical of certain second wave feminism, but he was relying on socialist feminism to make his argument. And some of the board members of the journal were so deeply offended that they couldn't allow for this essay to be published. And Genovese said, well, no way, he's going to publish it, right? And then that refusal then led to the dissolution of the whole thing.
Right.
So anyways, I'm bringing up some old figures for you to cogitate on, but perhaps you might say something about what it was like to, work with Christopher Lasch. I've been looking at his archive up there in Rochester, and
oh, really?
There's a lot of really interesting things that I'm seeing in there. There are projects that he never finished,
Right.
that are very interesting work.
Right. Well, let me just say a couple of things. I mean, at least one thing. I mean, I think Lasch did cause grief among parts of the left because he dared to raise some questions which I think were legitimate about the family and about feminism. You could disagree with him, but if you talk about cancel culture, I guess it begins there of some sort, that in fact he was considered, he was raising issues which shouldn't be raised. Is there a cost to a kind of feminism which is taking women out of the family? What happens to the family if there's no Everyone's working. What is the emotional cost? And people didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to hear it. And I think he did raise legitimate questions about, about not simply feminism, but looking at the inroads of capitalism into the family, the media, consumerism, and yes, and women working. What happens to family relations? These were legitimate issues which people didn't want to hear. They thought, that this was, reactionary. Too bad. I mean, these are legitimate issues to raise, and we still haven't, we haven't solved them. If anything, perhaps they've gotten worse. I mean, we don't know the answer. And in that sense, the family, the haven and the havenless world, still is a good issue. I mean, it's something which we haven't quite figured out.
Right. Right. Yeah,
and-
it's true. It's true. I mean, I myself am very influenced by his book on the family. It influenced my own work, what I've tried to do is create a dialogue with socialist feminists and even they call family abolitionists. And I'm critical of family abolition, but I try to be in a comradely way because I feel like we're not going to really solve. I mean, the cancel culture thing is an easy out. It just sort of gets everybody to just not talk to each other, and it promotes a certain hysteria politics that I think is very unproductive. But you also have to sort of keep in mind that the radical left does need to center its practice in something like where are the masses? Where is the common sense of the left? How do we tether with the common sense? I mean, right now with the Trump phenomenon, it's a certain paradox insofar as he's this sort of Bonapartist figure of history who seems to be upending certain liberal institutions, and maybe we'll see where it goes. But the point is that he represents some type of antagonism, some type of desire to fight the system. It's deeply anti-status quo, right? Of course, I'm no supporter of Donald Trump, but God, it would be so much more in line with Marxism if we had that energy on the Marxist left, that that radical agitation, right? That refusal of the two capitalist parties. Instead, I feel that we have something that Lasch talked about a lot, which is a type of paternalism with the Democrats. I mean, go back and read his essays in Agony of the American Left. And you know who he was criticizing was Michael Harrington, the founder of the Democratic Socialists of America, way back in the 60s, for his fatalistic embrace of the Democrats. And I felt like Lasch was so correct in hindsight, because that's exactly still the problem with the DSA, right? They can't get out of that paternalistic hold with the DNC. And I know that Lasch with Ehrenreich tried to do something that failed, to start a socialist party. And I don't know if you know much about that, but so you got along well with Lasch yourself?
Well, he was not an easy guy to get along with, I don't think. And I did, I was not personally very close to him. I mean, he helped me, and he wrote the introduction to my first book. So intellectually, I think we were running in parallel currents there. And I do think that the issue that he's raising, and what you raise, is absolutely true. I mean, how is it that the right has the energy and the left doesn't, or the left, and this was a criticism which is not new, but that and one might say it's already in Horkheimer, to what extent the left sees itself as new state managers and bureaucrats, and the right, and maybe it's all ideological, sees themselves as revolutionaries. They're going to abolish the state, but the left is going to improve it. And, so the left is going to improve the state and the right is going to abolish it. and the right has all the energy and the fervor. That's a problem.
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah,
problem.
it is. May I take a pause to use the restroom and then we'll conclude?
Okay.
Is that okay? Give me 1 second.
Because there's an anarchist component of it. To what degree that the left is really new bureaucrats, the fear that they're just trying to staff the state. And this, I was associated for years with Telos and Paul Piccone, and he himself, moved from sort of Gramscian politics to close to Lasch too. This suspicion that the left, was really were New Dealists. They simply wanted, a better state, and they were not really interested in fundamental transformation. And this becomes the Lasch argument as well, that you got to look for authentic movements from below, because it turns out the left is too much interested in state regulation and improving the state. And again, that's the paradox of the left and the right, where the right appears to be the revolutionaries and the left appears to be reformists, who just want to tinker with the system and improve the parks. But the right wants to abolish the state, at least in principle. So, I mean, there's an old, tradition to this suspicion of what the left is up to, which Lasch, I think, speaks to, and it has to be addressed. I mean, it's a legitimate, question about and it's legitimate, as you indicated, that why the energy seems to be on the right and not the left.
Yeah, it's very compelling. There's a certain anarchism in philosophy, perhaps, but a implicit pro-institutional, pro-state reliance simultaneously going on, and maybe the latter is sort of disavowed, whereas the former is publicly what is said. So the left may appear to be anti-statist and anti-bureaucratic, but the figures on the left are kind of enmeshed in the American bureaucracy.
Right.
And moreover, it seems to me very difficult to create a left alternative that would be, able to sort of escape that criticism that the left would give, that is similar to the criticism they gave to Lasch, which revolves around this idea that, well, if you criticize the welfare state, that's a fundamentally reactionary position to hold.
Right.
Although Lasch doesn't necessarily criticize the welfare state, he does, I think, have a lot of positive things to say about its blossoming under FDR, but then he studies its dissolution. So I'm not sure that is actually the case. And moreover, the welfare state under neoliberalism is, an asset-based welfare state. So it's really something completely different than the Roosevelt arrangement. Right. And once Trump is done with it, who knows what it will look like. That I suppose one insight or lesson from what you're talking about with Christopher Lasch and your own work, perhaps maybe a lesson for folks listening, which is to have the courage to stand against the dominant, mainstream view of things. It's hard to do that, I suppose. But
well, again, as I mentioned in one of these pieces, I mean, it's part of the paradox of left academics that they can parade, and this maybe goes back to Losurdo as well. They can parade their anti-imperialist revolutionary credentials. That's very easy to do. You put up the posters, you say you support it, but in your daily life in the university, you're totally weak. That is, you cater to the jargon and the discourse within your discipline, even while you proclaim your revolutionary credentials in terms of your support for China or one Soviet Union or Algeria. But that doesn't take courage. It takes more courage, the fights in the small areas where there's stakes, where you have to oppose your colleagues. And that's tougher, in fact. If you disagree about feminism, that's tougher than if you say, I support the anti-imperialist struggles in the world. But if you say, I don't think we should have, a feminist center or feminist studies because it's just part of identity politics, that's you're courting danger on those stands.
Well, I wouldn't. Yeah, I think, and that's I wouldn't. I mean, I think one of the things I've learned being a public figure on the left in these last however many years I've been writing and thinking on the left is that there is a tendency to lash out against the excesses of left liberalism in ways that are unproductive, right? That kind of ape or imitate the very same sensorial, right? So there's like a dialectic that happens. Like even if you look at like Deleuze and Guattari, the great French
Right.
radical anarchist guys. The irony is that in the early 60s, they wrote against Stalinist censorship.
Right.
Fast forward to today, and a lot of their followers are very at ease with enforcing what I would consider to be liberal censorship.
Right.
So how do you account for that dialect? How do you account for that reversal? I would like to see a form in which, because I'm writing a big thing on Marx and censorship, and Marx was adamant about the necessity of freedom of speech. I mean, he really sounds like a young Orwell, or like an Orwell in his work on because when he was a journalist after he did his dissertation, the state closed down the Rheinische Zeitung completely over censorship, and he's very clear that this is unacceptable. But at the same time, you have to sort of fight your battles. You can't just exert some kind of that's why I feel that the folks over at Compact Magazine sometimes, for example, they will sort of assault liberalism in ways that are almost like a revenge politics.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to really be a part of that. I don't know if that makes sense what I'm saying, but
okay. I mean, revenge politics meaning that,
like, for example, if I am a victim of censorship, when I have power, am I going to exert that censorship over others? No, I'm not, right? Is that, it's like the winds of power shift, right? Yes. And even I would say for folks that are critical of liberalism, the Trump moment is a way for people to exert a type of revenge, which I think we should temper and avoid.
Yes.
Because that's only just going to keep the cycle going.
Right.
It's a little vague, but.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't disagree. I mean, I think there's a blank anti-liberalism which drives the left to the right. And they hate, and there's some journalists, and I think of people like Glenn Greenwald and others who maybe hate so much liberalism that they become reactionaries. I mean, they despise so much of the liberal order that they basically become Trumpsters or very close to it.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at. That's exactly right. And I feel that Marxism can help people stay a little more grounded.
Okay, I agree.
Right.
Yes, absolutely.
Because I do think that it has been a very big debate for my generation about whether Marxism is a kind of anti-liberal practice or not.
Right.
To what extent is liberalism? Because we have a lot of my colleagues are writing works on John Rawls and Marxism, John Rawls and socialism, things like that. Like, what are the limits of incorporating liberal perspectives?
Right.
To what extent do they detract
Right.
So those are big debates that we have on my program.
Right.
Yeah. Do you have any advice to younger writers that are trying to connect to an audience beyond academics? Given that I think a lot of your books are written in such a way that you're transcending some of these parochial things.
Well, but my advice is the same advice is that I do think you have to buck the academic. You have restrictions, and you say yes, journalistic. You have to say, yeah, I'm writing for an audience beyond the profession. I want to address people who are not full-time comparative literature professors. And I think, and this is, people have argued this more recently, this is happening because the university is not expanding in the same way it once was. In fact, it seems to be shrinking in many ways, the humanities. So you have to look for audiences outside. The jobs aren't there anymore, the professorial jobs in the same way they once were. So that, I think, I'm credited with coming up with the term public intellectual, and I set it against an academic intellectual. And I think that remains, sort of the mission, that we have to, be intellectuals, but we have to be public intellectuals. We have to write and address a public and not just a discipline. It can be done. It's not easy, but it can be done.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really admire your work, and I thought this was a fabulous discussion. I will take your criticism of Losurdo into consideration.
Okay. Fair
but
enough.
He is a thinker that gives us quite a lot to work with. So I'm not
That's fair.
prepared to discard him.
Okay. That's fair.
Yeah. And by the way, his book on liberalism is quite good. I'd be curious what you think about that, by the way.
I'll take a look. All right.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Hopefully, do you have any projects that are on the burner, or that you have on the horizon coming up?
I mean, nothing major. I mean, I think I'll be doing something about which the essay I sent you about sort of the intellectual jargon, which has entered the public domain. Microaggression,
right?
Power differential, things like that, which came from the university and have started to spread. Not causing grief, I think, in the public world. And we see where it started, and we see what it's doing, and it's not helping. So I think I'm doing something about that.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again.
Okay, thank you.
Until next time.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.